Everyone, and welcome to this Science for Peace event. My name is Richard Sandbrook, and I'm moderating our discussion today. As you know, our distinguished guest is Richard Falk, and the issue we're addressing is ultimately understanding the Ukraine war. What is at stake? It's a very complex matter. And Richard has enunciated this idea of three levels of conflict to try and understand that complexity. And we'll look into that today. Let me say a few words about Richard. I could go on for 5, 10, 15 minutes talking about Richard, but I know he's a very modest fellow, and he'll forgive me if I spend only really 2 minutes in rapid summary. Richard Falk spent 50 years teaching international affairs and international law at Princeton University, and since then has been a research professor at the University of California at Santa Barbara. He has, at the United Nations, he has been involved in a variety of investigations and reports, usually on human rights violations. He has written many books, edited many others, and authored many articles. And as Arne Jurgensen, one of our panelists, and I have both individually stated, we've been reading articles and books by Richard Falk for our entire adult lives. So it's wonderful, Richard, to have you join us today. Thank you. Richard is coming to us from Turkey. Then I would like to say a few words about our two panelists. Paulina Chan recently received her bachelor's degree from University of Toronto and is now undertaking a joint master's program in international social policy at the London School of Economics and Fudan University, and she is joining us from Shanghai. And Arne lectures in international relations at the University of Toronto. He is also the chair of our very active working group on nuclear weapons. And so I'd like now to pass the Zoom window, so to speak, over to Richard. So Richard, thank you very much for coming this evening for you.
Thank you, Richard. It's a real pleasure to speak under the auspices of Science for Peace and to be with the other panelists and to be again in your presence after a long interval. Let me say, as a kind of prelude, that the Ukraine crisis, which envelops the Ukraine war, is one of the most complex conflict situations that has existed since World War II, in my view. And as Clausewitz famously talked of the fog of war, the Ukraine situation is understood beneath a very dense fog indeed. And that fog is partly a consequence of conflicting propaganda, hostile propaganda that is generated by the various sides to this conflict and creates understandings that rationalize the behavior of the different actors. So we have this combination of complexity, uncertainty, and enveloped in a dense fog of propaganda. And so that's a matter of background. And I've made a long effort to try to penetrate this situation to get a clearer understanding. And the best I've been able to do is to understand the Ukraine crisis as the unfortunate outcome of events that preceded the attack on Ukraine by Russia on February 24th, 2022, and is intertwined, in my view, with a geopolitical conflict that involves the US and indirectly Europe and NATO with Russia. They are the antagonists in the geopolitical war that I'm calling the second level of the conflict. And this in turn has agitated and reactivated the internal conflict between the eastern Donbass region of Ukraine and the rest of the country, and also has been preceded by controversial happenings in the 8 preceding years, with both Russia and Ukraine and the US giving their own very partisan narratives. So to seek an objective understanding, which I think is what we all should be striving for, is very, very difficult. And I say that as a matter of background. What we do know is that Russia clearly launched what, under international law, is a war of aggression on February 24th by attacking Ukraine without any kind of legally relevant provocation. There were politically relevant provocations, and that's part of the interpretive complexity. Western experts on making peace after the Cold War had warned Western governments, and particularly the US, that it would be a mistake to try to move NATO toward the east, and specifically toward Ukraine. George Kennan, perhaps the most influential architect of the Cold War itself and a specialist on Russia, had warned in very explicit terms that this would undoubtedly create a crisis with Russia. The US government over the last decade ignored these kind of warnings and assessments, and did its best to bring Ukraine into the NATO frame of reference, and help the anti-Russian forces in Ukraine to stage a very controversial coup in 2014 that overthrew a pro-Russian leader. And subsequently, it has been heavily involved in various ways in training, equipping, arming, diplomatically encouraging the Europeanization of the Ukraine. So how do you there's a problem of evaluation. Does one interpret the aggression in light of these provocations, or do we say this is such a serious and distinct violation of international law that it should be treated separately? And the UN General Assembly did in fact denounce the aggression. On the other hand, the UN is designed in a peculiar way, giving the 5 permanent members, the winners of World War II, the right of veto, which means in a very important legal sense that they are not bound by the Charter unless they agree to comply. In other words, they have a legal right of exception, which is a very peculiar kind of thing, and it was done deliberately, pioneered in a sense by the American president, Franklin Roosevelt, who interpreted the League of Nations, the predecessor to the UN, as failing because it didn't allow these dominant states to pursue their interests in a discretionary manner. So they left or didn't join the League. The idea of the UN was to get these actors into the organization and to pay the price of giving them this right of exception. But that muddies the assessment of behavior and makes it much less legally clear that they committed an unlawful act. It's a complex issue, and it's reinforced by the idea that only the victors in World War II were held accountable for their wrongdoing and their international crimes. In other words, Hiroshima and Nagasaki atomic attacks were not even investigated. And since then, there's been impunity for these dominant states, a lack of accountability. And so you do have a kind of ambiguity that pertains to the initial attack and how you connect the provocations that occurred in relation to Russia. Beyond that, the initial aggression, there are well-substantiated reports of Russian atrocities and threats of using nuclear weapons, which are also, from the perspective of international order, if not law, disruptive. And so one sees a pattern of Russian aggression and violation of the laws of war resisted by the Ukraine, but without appropriate efforts to seek a ceasefire and some sort of diplomatic resolution of the conflict. And that's a further complexity of the war, is that the fortunes of the two sides, the Russians and the Ukrainians, have ebbed and flowed. Sometimes it looked as if Ukraine could only inflict some damage in resisting the Russian assault, but that it would have to give up a substantial territory. At other times, later on in the second phase, it looked as though it was prevailing. And then the Ukrainian government was discouraged from any kind of diplomatic alternative to resisting this Russian assault. And then in a later stage, still the fortunes shifted once more, and now we're in a new fourth phase where again Ukrainian prospects look favorable, and they bear on what I've been calling the second level of conflict, which is the geopolitical conflict between the United States and Ukraine. Again, there's a lot of complexity because Ukraine is dependent for weapons and economic assistance and support on US and European assistance. And it is the leader, Zelensky, is not experienced in international affairs and is subject, it appears, to a good deal of influence or manipulation by the West, which has at various stages seemed to shift in relation to its own goals. But the principal goal of the West, and particularly the US, is to inflict an unacceptable outcome on Russia and to be willing to prolong the war in order to reach that result. Therefore, it has, rather than proposed a diplomatic resolution, it has demonized Putin as a leader, and it has emphasized the criminality of Russian behavior, something that really wasn't done very much even at the height of the Cold War. But it was obvious that the US didn't want this war to end for reasons other than the well-being of the Ukrainian people. It wanted to inflict a defeat on Russia, and it wanted to signal China at the same time that if it engaged in aggressive activity in relation to Taiwan, it would suffer significantly in a similar manner. From the Russian side, this was also not just about Ukraine. It was about reestablishing what had existed during the Soviet period of traditional spheres of influence along its borders, and to challenge what emerged after the Cold War, which was the unipolar control of global security by the United States, which created a military infrastructure of a global scale with hundreds of foreign military bases all over the world, navies in every ocean, militarization of space and underwater, and attempts to control cyber security and warfare as well. So that this was a challenge by Russia to that kind of unipolarity and staking a claim to geopolitical stature. In other words, that it too had the rights to impose certain kinds of security arrangements on states outside its own territory. The US has never foregone its spheres of influence in Latin America. It still imposes sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba, after decades, keeps these sanctions despite being one of the only countries in the world that supports such behavior. It intervenes in the Middle East in several different countries. It purports to have strategic interest in the Far East and in every part of the world. It's a global state in that sense, and the first global state. And this is what, in the second level of conflict, is what I mean by the geopolitical encounter directly between Russia and the U.S. and indirectly between China and the U.S. And China may be the more serious rival for the U.S. because of its economic and technological competitive quality. And so that the strategic stakes in the second level of warfare are extremely high, and they really will determine, in some sense, whether the unipolar aftermath of the Cold War, which was a period of bipolarity, whether that will enjoy a longer life, or whether we are entering a genuine period of multipolarity in which China and Russia will share with the United States this kind of extraterritorial security role. The third level of conflict, which preceded, again, the attack in 2022, involves the Donbass industrial region of Ukraine in the east, which is predominantly Russian-speaking and Russian-oriented, and the western parts of Ukraine, which have become, anyway, very anti-Russian and nationalist, and also very much opposed to the separatist tendencies of the Donbass region. Again, this hard to interpret, complex and contested facts. The pro-Russian side claims that Kiev government engaged post-2014 in massacres of the pro-Russian forces in the east. The pro-Kiev narrative emphasizes the separatist tendencies. Some have tried to compare what Russia is doing in relation to this Donbass region with what NATO tried to do in Kosovo in relation to Serbia, that is, to intervene and support the separatist tendencies of the Albanian minority that was being persecuted and allegedly mistreated by Belgrade and the Serbian central government. That again is a kind of far-fetched analogy, but it's been invoked by those that try to rationalize Russian behavior. So one of the things that is unfortunate about these three levels is that they're intertwined, and they're intertwined at the expense, in my view, of the Ukrainian people. In other words, the geopolitical stakes of the conflict have a logic that leads to the prolonging of the Ukrainian war between Russia and Ukraine, and to some extent to agitate the internal war between the Donbass region and the central government. So we have a situation where efforts at diplomacy have not been able to get positive results, where the spillover effects on Europe and on vulnerable countries in Africa and the Middle East with respect to food and energy are very serious, and when winter comes will become even more serious, and where the outcome of the Ukrainian phase of the conflict is likely not to vary very much whether the war is stopped today or in 2 or 3 years or 5 years from now. One anticipates some kind of arrangement of Ukrainian neutrality with respect to NATO and Europe, and some with withdrawal, some kind of guarantee, perhaps bolstered by UN peacekeeping forces, of the autonomous rights of the Donbass region and the 2 republics that have been formed there. So let me stop these introductory remarks by saying that I welcome commentary, and that I realize that this is an area of international politics where reasonable people can have drastically different understandings of the event. Let me stop there, Richard.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. That was a very clear exposition. So let's now turn to our 2 panelists and ask if they have, one of them has a question or comment to begin.
Paulina, did you want to start?
Sure, I can start. So firstly, Professor Falk, thank you so much for that introduction. It's very fascinating to hear the different dimensions of this unfortunate conflict. One of the things you did mention is the lack of diplomatic resolution involved with this conflict. And I wanted to mention that a recent Foreign Affairs article revealed that a peace deal might have been reached between Russia and Ukraine back in April of this year, but that the negotiations were intercepted by other world leaders. So now nearly half a year has passed and the conflict has only worsened in severity. Do you believe that there will be any viable and humane modes of de-escalation left that can be implemented at this point?
That's a very good question, and no one can give a definitive answer to it. It really is a function of political will, and if that political will exists primarily, I think, in Washington, but secondarily in Moscow, there would be a diplomatic compromise. And if you read Putin's February 22nd speech, he talks about all the Russian efforts at reaching a security compromise prior to the attack of the 24th. Now, whether he's genuine, he certainly exaggerating the Russian efforts, his own record in other places, southern Caucasus and Chechnya and so on, don't give one much confidence in his peaceful motivations. On the other hand, the West did seem to act extremely irresponsibly in creating these known provocations and in not at least testing whether there was a diplomatic way out. And all of this destruction and devastation and suffering that the Ukrainian people are feeling seems to me to be something that should have been attempted to be avoided. And it suggests the irresponsibility of the geopolitical actors. And that's why I think it's very important to grasp the impact of this second level of geopolitical encounter in relation to the war on the ground.
Thank you very much.
I have a slightly related question, but the one that focuses a little bit more on a different aspect of or a different level of the conflict, in particular the second level of the conflict. You're currently in Turkey, and one of the things that struck me as unique about Turkey's position with regard to this conflict is that on the one hand, it's part of NATO, and on the other hand, it seems to have been, in particular in April, which is what Paulina was referring to, much more involved with trying to produce an actual diplomatic solution to the problem. It seems to me that prior to the attack on the Ukraine in February, NATO seemed to be somewhat of an outdated institution. And that it was thrown a lifeline by this invasion of Ukraine that suddenly produced pronouncements of complete solidarity and complete support for the NATO side and a renewed relevance for NATO. But there have always been rather obvious cracks there, one of which is that quite clearly Turkey has always seen NATO in somewhat problematic terms and has slightly different interests from other NATO members with respect to Russia. But it also seems fairly evident that much of the rest of NATO is going to be paying an enormously steep price for the current trajectory of events, and that this will have some drastic impacts on the domestic politics, starting already with Italy, which is likely to elect a far-right government that's already talking about lifting sanctions on Russia and normalizing relations. Do you foresee that kind of problem on the NATO side in that second level of conflict?
Yes, I do. And I think you've formulated it extremely well. I mean, if you recall, in 1999, the same sort of argument was made in support of the intervention in Kosovo, where after the Cold War and the disbanding of the Warsaw Pact, it was questionable whether NATO had any role in the future international relations. And Madeleine Albright, the American Secretary of State, was very strong in saying we have to demonstrate that NATO is still useful. And Kosovo was an easy way of doing that back more than 20 years ago. And I think after Afghanistan and the frustrations of Afghanistan, there was a need to revive confidence in the Western Alliance and the Atlantic Alliance, which had been shaken also by Brexit and various other tendencies. So this seemed a way of spontaneously mobilizing a new spirit of alliance fervor in support of the rights of the Ukrainian people. And you even had the UK current Prime Minister, who was then Foreign Minister, talk about a global NATO, saying that it's not a matter of defending Europe, we have to be part of this global security system led by the US, but relevant everywhere, not just in terms of protecting the security of Europe. So I really think that is important dimension. And I think that Europeans, as you suggest, are beginning to wake up to the costs that the disproportionate costs that they are likely to pay, particularly in terms of energy and food prices and energy availability during the coming months. And they're questioning whether American leadership really pushed them toward sanctions that were really, first of all, dysfunctional, and secondly, not in their distinct national interests. So instead of strengthening NATO, it's quite likely that this will have an effect of weakening NATO by making the member countries think that they have distinct interests that are not always well represented by Washington. Let me just say a word about Turkey, because I'm right here in Turkey. And it, for some years, maybe for the last 10 or 12 years, Turkey has tried to situate itself as both in NATO and independent of NATO. It has, and I think that reflects its real interests and belief that it's important for Turkey to play an independent role in the region and beyond the region, and that it still wants to be part of Europe and part of the West. And it sort of tries to balance these apparent contradictions. In addition to that, Erdogan is seeking, the leader of Turkey, is seeking to enhance his prestige and international reputation in the face of a very difficult domestic economic crisis and upcoming elections. And this was a quite successful way of diverting attention, and also, I think, following a constructive path in really seeking to discover whether diplomacy could bring an end to the killing and the dangers of escalation, which I didn't talk much about, but has been part of that. Part of the broader picture is that in the intensification of the geopolitical war, you also get an intensification of the war on the ground, which could lead to escalation that comes closer to the nuclear threshold and has involved already this huge nuclear power plant in Ukraine. So it's a very dangerous situation that has been pushed for these other motivations into even more treacherous and precarious ground. So I think it's important to try to understand those issues that you both have raised.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. And at this point, we can move on to the Q&A session. And please, if you want to make a comment or ask a question, use the hand up signal, which is under reactions at the bottom of your screen. And Melissa will recognize you and unmute you. So I now go over to Melissa to carry this part of the Q&A session forward. Well, if no one else is going ahead, let me pose a question. There's one that's been on my mind the entire session, and that is to do with the third level of conflict. That is akin to a civil war within Ukraine, involving the Donbass largely on one side and Ukrainian nationalists on the other. For me, this level of conflict is the one I know least about. I don't because I'm not an expert on Ukraine at all. I'm not clear where the level of loyalties on each side. To begin with, I understand, of course, that the Donbass has a majority of Russian speakers, and I understand that on the other side, there have been moves against the Russian language in schooling and so on, which are certainly affronting the existing linguistic rights of Russian speakers. But I also understand that the right-wing, very right-wing, far-right group has been involved in confronting the Donbass republics. But what I don't understand is really the extent of commitment within the population of the Donbass to Russia, as opposed to Ukraine. Of course, just because people speak Russian doesn't mean that, by any means, that they are loyal or feel loyalty, one to Russia or want to rejoin Russia. So, Richard, do you have a better understanding of the levels of loyalties within the Donbass at this third level of conflict?
It's very hard to quantify the degree of alienation in terms of objections to the policies and objections to the fundamental arrangement. And the pro-Russian narrative is that after the coup against a pro-Russian leader in Kiev and the subsequent suppression of the human rights and the separatist tendencies in Donbass, there was the sense that only by separatism could the people of Donbass enjoy minimal security. In addition to that, there seems to have been a good deal of existential identification with Russia rather than Ukraine. In other words, there was Russian nationalism in Donbass. How deep and how broad that is almost impossible to tell. And the Russians agreed to this Minsk agreement that was supposed to guarantee human rights and language rights and cultural issues in Donbass, but it was pretty clearly broken by the Ukrainian government because it was fiercely anti-Russian and wanted to unify the country in a kind of Ukrainian, as a Ukrainian really a Ukrainian European country. And therefore, the Donbass was an outpost of resistance to that. As I say, to understand what the balance of opinion is on these issues is almost impossible for an outsider to get. And I wouldn't trust many insiders because everybody has a dog in the fight, and it's very difficult to assess whether you're receiving accurate information or not.
Yeah, can I speak here? Is that the question about loyalty is a very, very difficult one at this time, because all that's happened. Now, if you go back to 2014, when the Donetsk Republic and those were being formed and voted on, there was quite a lot of reason for the Donbass, or at least the eastern half of the Donbass, to want to be pro-friendly with Russia, because more than half their trade was with Russia. All the economy was all tied in with Russia. I mean, they're next door. You know, it's like the difference between Los Angeles and San Francisco or something. You know, it's not very far. The border's right there. So it's very obvious that all those folks were pro-Russian, you could say, or Russian friendly would be a better way to say it, I think. And that's why the Party of Regions, which came up in 2000, before 2010, they had not 85% or so of the voters in the 2010 election voted for the pro-Russian president. 85%, and that's Crimea as well, and that's down by the port, which was the big fight. They were all pro-Russian or Russian friendly because they had economies all tied together, and plus most of them spoke Russian and everything else. And after the 2014 coup, is that political group, which was pro-EU, they had to follow the EU guidelines. They wanted to get in the EU, and a lot of the young people want to get in the EU too, because it sounds so cool. You're going to get your iPhones and everything else cheaper. So there's a lot of propaganda for that. And so, I'm going on. I'm sorry, but let me move it on to this. Is that what's interesting to me is the question of how to resolve this at this time, and it seems like going back to the Minsk agreements is a key, a good solution. But how do we get people onto the negotiating table, and especially when 90% of the American population believes that this is a good, we're in on this. The propaganda has worked, which it did in Iraq and Afghanistan times. The propaganda has worked. The American public are in on this fight. We're going to beat the shit out of the Russians. This is our time. And we're going to help the poor Ukrainians do this. And so it's going to keep on rolling because the money's going to keep on rolling. The weapons will keep on rolling. And the thought is we're just going to bankrupt Russia. And because we can last out longer than they can. That's the trouble.
No, I think what you say is very perceptive and gets to the heart of why this war is not likely to end quickly or in a responsible manner. And there's no question that this way of thinking about global strategy and geopolitical advantage often excludes considerations of what happens to people on the ground. It's kind of abstract geopolitics at the expense of human beings. And therefore, the likelihood of having a diplomatic outcome under these conditions is very difficult, and to expect Moscow to accept the Western gloss on what has happened in terms of Russian defeat and Putin's miscalculation and criminality and all of that creates a very dangerous possible future scenario of escalation in which Putin gets desperate and the US thinks it has him cornered, and the nuclear threshold becomes more and more relevant, and each side wants to take the initiative to avoid the consequences of being struck first. It's very much the greatest potential danger since the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, not to mention the Taiwan spillover effects that could also be very dangerous.
Our next question is from John Sharkey.
Hi there. Thank you for your overview, Richard. That was excellent to put the this tragic conflict into perspective. You know, the various players and the extreme complexity of the situation. I have a question regarding the let's call it the nationalist Ukrainians. The West refers to the nationalists and just leaves it at that. People on the left refer to those people as fascists, particularly groups like the Azov Battalion and the Right Sector and various other militias. Can you comment on that? But could you comment on the role that you think that those particular elements in the nationalist framework there are playing in this conflict? Thank you.
Well, I think that touches on the density of the fog, that it's very difficult to assess the competing narratives, which the pro-Ukrainian narrative being that these are marginal, not really fascist, they've been defamed, and that they are basically defending the country. The anti-Ukrainian, anti-US position suggests that the whole Ukrainian governmental formation has been extremely reactionary and right-wing, and that these elements, these militia elements, have been trained by the CIA apparently, have been seen as so-called strategic assets, and therefore there's a great willingness to see them as all part of a seamless fabric of nationalism and national resistance, which is really false, and but it's very hard to penetrate. And one of what makes it so very difficult is the way in which, as in earlier conflicts, the mainstream media has followed the Pentagon rather than really given us a independent, objective view of the complexities and the uncertainties and the genuine controversy. It's one of these areas that the media tends in foreign policy to see everything in black and white terms as portrayed by the Pentagon and State Department, and doesn't dwell on the contradictions or the nuances or even the humanitarian effects of the side that we're against. Now, in Ukraine, as opposed to Iraq and Yemen and other places, Palestine, there's a huge emphasis on the humanitarian suffering that Russia has inflicted, which you don't, if you go back and look at the media coverage of the Iraq intervention or the Vietnam War or Afghanistan, you won't see comparable coverage of how human beings are suffering from this war experience. Though the casualty totals in Iraq were many times greater than what the Ukrainians have experienced at least in this period of 6-7 months.
Yeah, I also had on the issue of public media and the positions they take, that remarkable if you contrast this talk here now with the variety of talks there are at the Munk School of International Study on the Ukraine war. They have a lot of these kind of discussions, and every one of them focuses on the first level of conflict. That the Ukraine has suffered aggression by Russia. They're heroic in their resistance, so wanting to understand that. I think most of us here are, maybe all of us are highly sympathetic to this idea of 3 levels of conflict. And yet, it's strange that in universities, in conventional international relations discourse, I mean, from what I've seen, and I'm limited what I've seen, there is no such recognition of these levels of conflict that focus on the first level only. I find that remarkable.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with you, and it's one way of putting it is that government propaganda is very effective, and it is able to manipulate the media in such a way as to make it align with its narrative of what's taking place. And so this really distorts what ordinary people receive as so-called news. And a democracy really can't function if it doesn't have access to the truth or the truths if it's more complex. And we sort of understood this in the Trump era of post-truth society. People talked of the post-truth society, but it's deeper than that. Trump was a kind of crude symptom of this Orwellian type situation of using political language in a manipulative way that excludes inconvenient facts. And it was, in a way, if one has to go back to Dan Ellsberg's release of the Pentagon Papers, because he became so convinced that the American people were not being told the truth about the Vietnam War. And only by reading these documents did he feel he learned the truth, even though he was an expert, worked in the Pentagon, had worked at the Rand Corporation, and so on. But this problem is very much at the core of the misunderstanding and partisanship that has been generated around the Ukrainian issue. And of course, it has been easier to generate that because the victims are seen as white Europeans. And there's undoubtedly a racist component here in terms of the degree of mobilization that has taken place. And it's unpleasant to have to acknowledge that, but I feel it's part of this complex reality.
Thank you. And for the final, we have time just for the one more comment or question. So let's turn now to Phyllis Creighton. Please unmute.
If Americans, the American public, or even the American governing class understands that if they push Putin far enough, we might see a nuclear attack that would not just threaten Europe, but would have worldwide impact. And your scientists have done a good job of explaining over and over what the consequences of use are. But I wonder how much young people in the United States understand the horror, the suffering, humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And if this could be a break on their continuing to support violence in Ukraine.
No, that's a crucial question to which I've given a lot of thought myself. And it's not only young people, I think it's the policymakers themselves don't understand what the reality of this nuclear war threat, if it ever materializes, what it would mean to organize civilizational life. And of course, young people are particularly kept in ignorance about how dangerous the world is being made for them, not only with respect to nuclear weapons, but the failure to address other problems with the seriousness they deserve. And we're paying a great price to manage this unipolar world. You know, the hundreds of foreign military bases, the navies all over the world. This is not cost-free. It is part of the declining economic and social reality in this country, and can't be altogether divorced from the terrible violence of these random shootings and expressions of extreme alienation here in the United States itself. So one is, in some literal sense, playing with something worse than fire. One's playing with nuclear conflagration and with the whole future of humanity and the livability of the planet, the habitability of the planet. So it's a serious moment of crisis that we find ourselves enmeshed in.
Richard, thank you so much for your clarification of a very, very complex situation in the Ukraine war. I very much appreciate your joining us today. And thanks also to our panelists, Paulina and Arne, for their initial questions, and for everyone else in turning out and staying with us for this hour. So thanks, and we'll see you again I hope on October the 5th, when we discuss nonviolent tactics for the 21st century. So good night, and thank you.
And goodbye to everyone. It was a very stimulating session for me.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. It was a
Bye-bye.
great pleasure.
My pleasure.